Colleen, welcome. Thank you so much for contributing to the conference this year.
Thank you.
Over to you for a quick introduction, and then we'll get the video going.
Sure. Thanks for having me. I'm honored to be here. Thanks for attending my talk. My background is that I've been in the design and web industry for almost 25 years. My consulting business is Grotzer Graphics, and we provide design and accessibility services. I got into accessibility back in 2016, and it's completely transformed my business. So now I tell everyone else about it. And I've provided InDesign accessibility training to the US Department of the Interior and at the Creative Pro InDesign and Accessibility Summit and some other events. And then through my other business, which is called Creative Boost, I teach accessibility courses to designers and also to web designers and developers. And I have several design business resources and mentor them. And I also have a podcast called Design Domination. So that's a little bit about me.
Awesome. Thank you. Well, I will get the screen share and the video going, and we'll be on our way.
In this presentation, I'll talk about designing with accessibility in mind. I'll get into misconceptions about accessible design, how your audience benefits from accessible design, how you benefit from it, and then some guidelines that pertain to design and how to check
the
colors.
video isn't showing.
We're staying with Slack instead.
That's neat. It was showing before, yes? When I did the test, the video was coming through okay?
Yes.
Yeah.
Was the audio coming through in a fit of irony?
Yeah, the audio is coming through, but we see your Slack on the screen.
Gotcha. I just shared the wrong screen. That's what I assume, at least. Are we there now?
Yes.
Yay. Can everyone still see on their Zoom the captions and the interpretation?
Yes.
Okay, awesome.
In this presentation, I'll talk about designing with accessibility in mind. I'll get into misconceptions about accessible design, how your audience benefits from accessible design, how you benefit from it, and then some guidelines that pertain to design and how to check colors. But first, I want to dispel some myths that a lot of people have about accessible design. You might think only web designers or web developers need to be concerned with accessibility. But accessibility applies to more than websites. For instance, it also applies to apps and electronic documents and the text, the graphics, and the interactive elements in them. Accessibility is ugly. That's another thing I hear. A lot of websites and designs are, in fact, ugly, but they're not ugly because they're accessible. They were just poorly designed. Accessibility actually has nothing to do with how visually attractive a document, a website, a design, or a graphic is. Another one I hear a lot is accessibility means designing with only dark colors. Well, one time we designed an email that the client wanted to have an accessible color scheme, and they initially sent us the color codes for only their darker brand colors. They thought we couldn't use any of their lighter colors. And I hear this from a lot of designers too. But it actually depends on how the colors are used together. Here's an accessible website I designed and built a few years ago. It isn't ugly, and it doesn't use only dark colors. So now let's get into how your audience benefits from accessible design. Your audience is made up of potentially 20% of people with a disability. It could be less. It could be more, especially if you particularly serve people with a disability. Some of the people who are affected by our color choices are people with a visual disability, such as low vision. Low vision may be caused by macular degeneration, cataract, diabetic retinopathy, or glaucoma, to name a few. Low vision could mean that someone can't see things in the center of their vision or on the sides. Maybe they can't see in low light, or they have blurry or hazy vision. People with color blindness are also affected, which includes 1 in 12 males and 1 in 200 females. Someone might be born with color blindness, or it could actually occur as a result of a head injury. I know a colorblind designer whose family, both the males and females, have different types of color blindness. And there are several types of color blindness. One type is red-green, and that's the most common form. And there's 4 types of that. Green looks more red, or red looks more green and less bright. And then there are 2 other types where someone can't tell the difference between red and green. Here, the original photo is on the left, and the one on the right shows how someone with red-green color blindness would see that same photo. The colorblind designer that I mentioned, he took my accessible design course, and I used this as an example in there, and he jokingly said to me he indeed does not see the difference between these 2 photos. Blue-yellow is another form of color blindness. Now, it's less common, and there are 2 forms. They make it hard or impossible to tell the difference between blue and green, and yellow and red, or yellow and pink. And again, here we have the original photo on the left, and the one on the right shows how someone with blue-yellow color blindness would see it. Note how the blue building looks more green, the green building looks more gray, and the yellow building looks pink. Complete color blindness is rare, and it affects men and women equally. So again, here we have the original photo and then how someone with complete color blindness would see this. People with a perceptual processing disorder are also served by accessible color choices. A perceptual processing disorder is not actually an eye issue. It's really a problem with the brain's ability to process visual information. Irlen syndrome is a type of perceptual processing disorder. Try to say that 3 times fast. And that's sometimes referred to as scotopic sensitivity syndrome or visual stress. Now, according to the Irlen Syndrome Foundation, this disorder affects 14% of the U.S. population and includes some people with learning difficulties, autism, attention and concentration issues, and others. To someone with Irlen syndrome, a stark black and white contrast that's used for text can cause the text to appear to be blurry or floating, or have a halo effect, or like another effect has been applied, or moving, or wavy, shaky, or at an angle, or swirling, or parts of it might even disappear, as you can see here. People with a cognitive, learning, or neurological disability also benefit from accessible color choices. And certain colors can actually help with comprehension. All sighted users, with or without a disability, are affected by our color choices. Otherwise, we might end up with text that looks like this. Can you read that? Or this. This text fails to appear. I guess they want you to too. Or we might end up with a button that is not only hard to read, but it looks like an inactive button, which means it doesn't become active until you fill out all the form fields, for instance. Now let's get into why it's important for you to design with accessibility in mind. And I'm talking about besides this being the right thing to do, because sometimes people don't understand other benefits to it. The first reason is revenue. When it comes to a website, 71% of users with a disability will leave a website that's not accessible. And where do you think they go? They go to a competitor site, and they may or may not return to your site. Let's look at a few examples here of how this could actually play out. So let's say there's a legally blind woman who goes to your website and she's trying to understand how your service can help her, but she finds it hard to read the small gray text. She doesn't use a screen reader, so she zooms in on the text in the browser. But it's still too light for her to read. So she leaves the site feeling frustrated, and you just lost a sale. How about a man with color blindness goes to shop on your site for a product? He's unable to make out the hyperlinks to products because to him, they don't look any different from the body text. He leaves and goes to a competitor's site where it's much easier to make a purchase. The second reason is brand recognition. Not keeping accessibility in mind when creating your brand color scheme can affect brand recognition. And that's because if you have to change some of your colors later on to make them be accessible to work together, if those changes are drastic, that could result in people not recognizing your branding. Will you lose business because some people may not immediately recognize your branding? I mean, think about McDonald's. What if the golden arches were changed to brown? Here's an example of what I mean with one of my websites. The branding of my consulting business uses a light green and gray as the two main colors. And purple is what I want to use as more of an accent color. The green heading you see in the first screenshot, that's after I had darkened it. But it still does not meet contrast requirements. It would actually have to be a much different, darker hue of green, like an army green. And that would have changed my brand color palette and the brighter look I wanted the overall design to have. But addressing color and contrast issues doesn't stop there. You don't want your website to use an accessible color palette and then your other materials, like your documents, have the original non-accessible color palette. It's important that they're consistent. That will affect the integrity of your visual branding. Not keeping accessibility in mind when designing can negatively affect your reputation. When you don't consider potentially 20% of your audience, it comes across as, we don't care about being inclusive. There's a great saying by Ekaterina Walter. If we do not intentionally include, then we will unintentionally exclude. That can give you a negative reputation. Not only that, but people with a disability are 3 times as likely to avoid that business and twice as likely to dissuade others from doing business with it. And we all know how much word of mouth and reviews on Facebook or Google can help or hurt a business. When you don't design with accessibility in mind, you end up with the cost for remediation, and that means to fix it and make it accessible. It is much more costly to remediate a design, a website, and documents after the fact, when accessibility is an afterthought, than it is to incorporate it into the design process. Often when I'm remediating InDesign files for accessibility, I have to modify the color palette, although I avoid that as much as possible. But you can see here how changing the light green to an army green looks drastically different. So accessibility is definitely something to consider even in the beginning with brand identity design. Sometimes it's a case of needing to rework the design with different colors. And sometimes the design itself, keeping the existing colors but changing how they're used together. In this case, I changed the design to use the light green against the purple and then used orange in a decorative way. But again, changing the design after the fact is costly and time-consuming because accessibility was an afterthought, and you're now revisiting the design process. And that also adds additional time that you have to review the design. When it comes to color and accessibility, there are several guidelines that apply. The Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, called WCAG for short, tell us how to be compliant. There are 3 levels of conformance, A, AA, and AAA, and they range from minimum to strict. The typical level of conformance to meet is AA. One of the WCAG guidelines that deals with color is 1.4.1 use of color, which says that color cannot be the only visual means of conveying information, indicating an action, prompting a response, or distinguishing a visual element. Some examples of those would be text, so headings and body text, pie charts, line graphs, and hyperlinks. WCAG 1.4.3 contrast minimum says that text and images of text that are normal size must have a minimum contrast ratio of 4.5 to 1 against their backgrounds. But if it's large text, then it only needs to meet a minimum of 3 to 1 against the background. Now, large text is at least 14 points and bold, or approximately 18.66 pixels and bold, or at least 18 points or 24 pixels in any weight. Now, if you're looking to adhere to WCAG AAA, the strictest level of conformance, and that's rare, then normal text would need to meet a 7 to 1 ratio or greater, and large text would need to be 4.5 to 1 or greater. Normal size text is likely to be your body text, sidebar text, running headers and footers, captions, footnotes, graph text, hyperlinks, table text, form fields, and buttons. While large text is likely to be used for headings and maybe infographic text and maybe table headers. Now, there's no contrast requirement for logos or decorative elements that don't convey meaning, such as decorative borders or decorative icons, bullets, quotation marks used in pull quotes, and inactive user interface components, such as a button that is not able to be clicked until all required form fields are filled out, or text that happens to be part of an image that isn't trying to convey that. So, in other words, in these examples, unless we're trying to use the photo of the street sign in place of the words South 2nd Avenue, or unless we want the words in the book photo to be red, then these images of text do not need to meet contrast requirements. Heat maps don't have to meet contrast requirements. Heat maps have to use low contrast colors so that you can see the page content beneath the colors. And screenshots don't have a contrast requirement. WCAG 1.4.11 non-text contrast says you need at least a 3 to 1 ratio of contrast against the adjacent colors for user interface components and their various states, such as hover and focus, and graphical objects. So that means that hyperlinks need to meet the contrast requirement for text at the size that they're being used against the background. But they also need to meet a 3:1 ratio against the adjacent color, meaning the color of the body text. Otherwise, styling, such as an underline, is needed to show that it's a hyperlink. And then also hover and focus states. Hyperlinked social media icons are another example. Form field borders are another example. And graphical objects that convey meaning, such as pieces of a pie chart, because it's conveying meaning between the square in the legend with the corresponding pie piece. Now, to ensure that we're meeting these requirements, we want to check the contrast of the colors that we're using and how they're being used. So what we do is we paste the hexadecimal codes of the foreground and background colors into a checker such as WebAIM's contrast checker. And that checker will then give you the contrast ratio of that color combination, and it will let you know if it passes or fails for normal or large text, or for graphical objects and user interface components, and for AA or AAA conformance. There's also the Paciello Group's Color Contrast Analyzer app that you can use to input those hex codes, or actually you can also use RGB values, or you can sample color. And that you can do anywhere on your screen. So you just open it and then click the eyedropper icon and hover over the foreground color that you want to sample, and then do the same for the background color. I do want to mention, though, that I don't find this to be as precise as actually using hexadecimal codes or RGB values, and in some cases, that difference is enough to affect whether a color combination passes or fails. And I find that this app is extremely helpful when you need to sample color from a tint of a color, say 50% of a color. If you're using Word, you can go to your colors palette, from within a paragraph style, for example, and just make sure that you select the second option at the top, and then choose the RGB sliders option, and then you'll see both the RGB values and the 6-digit hex code there. If you're using PowerPoint, you can go into the theme colors, and it has a very similar menu, obviously, to Word. Just select that second option again, and then RGB sliders, and you'll have the RGB values and the hex code right there. Now, InDesign is a bit trickier. You just go to your swatches panel and double click a color, and if it's not already in RGB mode for the color mode, just change that over, even just temporarily, and then you'll get your RGB values right there, and below that you'll see the hex code. And then if you don't want to save it, just don't save it. In Canva, it's super easy. You just put your cursor in the text that you want to get the color value for, and then on the left side, the colors appear, and when you hover over them, it will show you the hex value there. Now, you can do the same thing for an object as well. Besides checking contrast, we can check to see how something would look to someone with color blindness. And we can check for this by using a color blindness simulator. I like the Coblis color blindness simulator, and here's that. I've uploaded a pie chart, and the color blindness simulator then shows how it would look to people with different types of color blindness. And if we compare them all together, you can see how very different these appear to different people. And in some cases, you can still make out the differences in the legend, but with some types of color blindness, there really isn't much of a difference between them visually. There's also an app, and that's called Sim Daltonism. you open it and then it has this black outline, which you see on the screen there, and you can place that anywhere on your screen and then change the menu options to show varying types of color blindness. And again, you can just position that anywhere on your screen. In Adobe Illustrator, you can go to View and then Proof Setup, and then you'll have two options to show different types of color blindness. You can also do the same thing in Adobe Photoshop. I know I've probably thrown a lot at you in this presentation, but I hope that you enjoyed it and learned a lot. Let's wrap up by just going over a few key points. Thinking about accessibility in the design process saves time and money. Accessible design is good for everyone. Accessible design is good for business. Don't use color alone to convey information. Check color contrast. If you're interested in learning more about accessible design and creating accessible branding, check out my Accessible Branding and Design course. And since you attended this talk, you can save $50 with code TECHOK through April 30th. I also have a Foundations of Website Accessibility course. You'll also find my Design Domination podcast and free guides. And if you need help with creating accessible branding, documents, or websites, or with remediation, visit gratzergraphics.com. I'm on LinkedIn, so feel free to connect with me there, or you can join me in my Design Domination Facebook group.
I really appreciate the emphasis on visual design accessibility. We, in our assessment work, I never say 100% of the time we find issues with contrast and use of color. It's got to be 98, 99. And this is web and non-web content. So really glad that you could come in and speak to that. And now we can look at questions and such that we have. Lisa, how are we looking on questions? I had technical issues.
There's a couple in the Q&A that I can go ahead and answer.
Okay, sure.
So the first question is from Monica, and she asked, why is level AAA rare? And that's a great question. There's probably a few reasons. I mean, just from talking to other colleagues in this space that do accessibility work, I know that it's a rare request. So I'm speaking from that, but also a lot of times, like when I'm talking to potential clients, a lot of times, you know, it's hard enough to convince them to do accessibility. I mean, usually they're coming to me for that anyway, but if they don't already know about it, you know, they don't understand it, and I have to do a lot of education. So to try to get a client to just do AA is sometimes hard enough, unfortunately. AAA is, you know, it's more extensive, there's more involved, and there are some things that are actually, you know, that wouldn't take much more effort to achieve after you hit AA, but there are some things that may not be possible, or they may not be possible to do, or they may not be possible to do within a client's budget. So I think those are probably a few of the reasons why. And then Christina asked, I don't see hex codes with Word and PowerPoint 2016. Is it included in more recent versions? I'm actually using a very old version, much older than that. The way I was able to access those, and hopefully you can do this with the 2016 version, wasn't actually in the it was actually in the style palette, going into the style palette and then going into a particular style and then clicking on the color in there. And then that's where you'd see that menu I brought up, which then shows you the RGB values and the hexadecimal codes in one screen like that.
Awesome, very good. And Alyssa just dropped links to your podcast or in the chat. Let's see what else we have. Just Kevin had mentioned that bold is a weight of 700 or higher from his research. And he agreed with the point that was made at that point in time. I don't remember where that was in the playback.
Yeah, because some fonts, they don't call the bold weight bold. They might call it 700 instead. You know, they might have like a semi-bold and then a bold and then like a black. So they have like different variations of bold.
And Dennis just dropped another list of color contrast tools that is out on WebAx.
Yeah, some of them will do RGB, like the Paciello group. Well, now they're called TPG. TPG Color Contrast Analyzer will allow you to input RGB. Some only allow hex codes. Some don't allow you to sample. And they usually allow you to adjust the lightness and darkness to, you know, try to get a closer color to
Mm-hmm.
still meet the requirement.
I kind of like the WebAIM tool for that because it keeps the same family. You know, you don't have to think about what do I need to adjust to find another color. It keeps it family and just adjusts it up and down on the brightness. So I think that's, for me, that's the most straightforward one. If you, when you want to find an alternative color.
Yeah, I use that one a lot. I like any color checker that I can input the hex values or RGB values, because those are more accurate than sampling color from the screen, because that's just kind of what's the word I'm thinking? It's kind of approximated.
Yeah, and especially like you mentioned, the really close. If you have something that's, you know, actually 4.51 to 1, you can end up with a false positive that says, hey, this is not right. This is, you know, 4.49 to 1 as it calculates. So especially when you're right on those boundaries of the requirements in the standards, it can be a little bit tricky. And to reinforce, I don't know, I think part of why AAA is rare, to come back to that thought as well, AA is what's written into most laws and policies. I think that drives a lot of the focus on AA as well. There's a question to come back to the web content guidelines. Any changes coming with WCAG 2.2 on this front?
Yes, there's, well, I don't know if it has to do with color. I haven't spent too much time looking at the working draft, but it is online.
Yeah, and I know they've done more with 2.2 specifically, and they did this with 2.1, more emphasis on the realistic needs of people who have low vision. The 2.0 just didn't go as far on that front. And I know in what I've seen about WCAG 3, which was formerly silver, it's completely different. It's going to be a completely different approach. So there will be a lot of changes, but that's a ways out yet. We're not going to have WCAG 3, I don't think, for a while, certainly not adopted into state or federal standards. We've had several links come in. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I see that Bruce asked a question. He said, how do you check color contrast when using opacity? That's a great question. So for things like having to sample or trying to check the like text over a background color or background photo rather, or to check something that involves a tint of a color or a semi-opaque color, then I'm going to use something that samples like the TPG color contrast analyzer for those situations. Oh, would you share again the quote regarding unintentionally is intentionally? I think it was, if we don't intentionally include, we unintentionally exclude.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think it kind of sums up accessibility pretty well.
Yeah, it does.
Because people will ask us, hey, is this vendor, you know, are they going to give us an accessible product? And it's something that has to be done willfully. And so if you look at their public site and it's not in good shape as far as accessibility, it's relatively safe in our experience to infer that they don't have a program around it, that they're not really injecting it into the work.
I just want to mention real quick, Dax will be speaking tomorrow, but I really want to mention his he has a website, I'll put it in the chat here, accessibilityscripts.com. And there's one that I use in InDesign. It's an InDesign specific script. And if you have a lot of colors where you need to check the combinations of them, like if you have a long document with a lot of color combinations, for example, then if you don't want to sit there and sample them all or copy and paste codes into WebAIM or another contrast checker, what his script does is it will go ahead and do that for you when you run it within the document. And then it will show you which ones pass for AA, which ones pass for AAA, which ones don't pass at all, and if they pass for large text only. So it's a big time saver.
That's awesome. I hadn't heard of that. We've gotten more traction with InDesign designers here recently, you know, who are looking at what can I do to make my stuff more accessible. And a lot of the tooling just isn't there for InDesign or for PDF on the visual side. So it's cool to have that. And yeah, like you said, Dax Castro will be joining us tomorrow to do a session on PDF accessibility. So we're looking forward to that as well. Any other questions? I've been a slacker about Slack. I have not checked the Slack channel to see if we've got anything there question wise.
So Christine is asking, I tried to quickly jot down, but missed it. Can you say again, what items don't have requirements for contrast? Quotation marks, pull quotes, heat maps. Right. So heat maps, screenshots, if you like your bullets, like if you're using, you know, a bullet or like an image for a bullet, like quotation marks for pull quotes, like, yeah, like you said, decorative lines, decorative borders, anything that's not conveying information, that's not conveying meaning, and logos.
And that is, I think that's one of the things that's changed a little bit in 2.1 and in 2.2, which of course, again, those aren't written into official policy at the federal or state level yet. So that would be an internal policy consideration. You know, if you're aiming for WCAG 2.1 or 2.2, when it's finalized, then you're actually going to be going beyond what's commonly done for the reasons we talked about before. But you'll get more into some of the visual design stuff that's not covered by 2.0.
And I have a handout for this presentation, so all of this is in there as well. And then Mark asked, any recommendations for monitors? Honestly, I don't have a clue. I'm not up on the latest like hardware stuff at all. I'm really bad about that. I used to be really good about it. I have no idea.
Yeah, and I'm in the same boat. I mean, I think there's so much variation. And I do think it's a bigger concern at those times when you have a borderline contrast ratio, right? And you'll find those, but again, in our experience, most of the contrast issues are pretty, I don't know, not borderline. I guess they're pretty serious when we run across them. Any other questions from anybody? There are a few comments in the chat, just that logos, and I think you mentioned this, you don't need to worry about contrast in logos. Now, remember too, one point that I think is important is that there's what the standards that are built into different laws say, and then there's good design, right?
Right.
And so there's the question about the standards and conformance, but in general, what we always suggest is to go above and beyond and make sure that your logos, you know, basically anything, like you said, that has meaning, make sure that the contrast hits that standard, even if it's not a strict requirement to do so, because ultimately it's about the experience of the people who are trying to consume the content.
Right. I mean, if you just go by WCAG, even if you go by WCAG AA, you still could technically not have an accessible site and a good user experience. So it's like, what I tell designers all the time is like, just don't, you can like use WCAG as a guide, but like the goal is accessibility. The goal is an accessible design, an accessible document, an accessible website, whatever it might be. The goal is not to just satisfy WCAG and just like take a bunch of boxes off and be done.
Yeah, I tell people that it's the floor for expectations. It's the minimum that you need to do is this, but focus more on the process and on the work. And then conformance should be an outcome if you're doing it with these inclusive design. If you're doing it with an inclusive design mindset. Dennis posted the WCAG 2.1 non-text contrast that's out there.
Yeah, and when you were talking about like logos, I mean, I think I use this as an example in this presentation too, but you know, that's also why I teach a course on accessible branding, because the branding is where everything starts. Like my own logo, but before I got into accessibility and even knew what it was, my own logo using light green and a not so dark gray, you know, having to use like my accent color to fulfill most of the contrast requirements because I don't want to darken, you know, the other colors, that affects branding. So if you don't think about it at the branding stage, then, you know, it all trickles down from there, and then you end up remediating a lot of things, and it's just so costly.
Well, and where our program is based at Oklahoma State University, and literally part of the brand is that we're America's brightest orange, because one of the school colors is a very bright orange, which of course the current contrast approach, which I think this is one of the things that's going to change with WCAG 3. But orange, as you probably well know, is tricky. I mean, whether it's a dark orange or ours, yeah, right.
Yeah.
Orange is difficult, and our web team at OSU has done a really good job of paying attention to the font size and weight when they use orange, paying attention to background colors and sticking with dark background colors. And it's been an iterative process, because you can't really marginalize the tagline for the institution. That color needs to be prominent. I don't know that they've hit it everywhere, but I think they've done a really, really good job of making sure that the orange is used in a way that sticks with the brand and that is obvious, but they're also really mindful of contrast when it comes to text and backgrounds. But it is a challenge, and something like that. The tagline wasn't inherited, but the school colors have been around a while, and no one's going to change them.
Right.
They're going to have to work with what they have and be creative. So
right.
Yeah, it's a really good point.
It definitely makes you become more of a problem solver.
Right.
Designers are problem solvers to begin with. This makes you even more of a problem solver.
Right. Yeah, for sure. I don't see any other questions. I'll double check over. I don't see anything on Slack. So if no one has any other questions, which I'll always give a quick pause to see if that makes somebody go, oh, okay. Yeah, Kevin just pointed out that black always works with orange. It does with the brighter oranges. The more burnt oranges, I'm not sure. Actually, I tried it out.
I can use these two together.
Yeah.
I have to darken the orange for just slightly for form fields.
Well, and that's another thing that we have been able to advise people on, whether it's internally or externally. There's an agency in Oklahoma who had a green that I think if they went one shade darker, it was fine. And it's one of those things that was so subtle that the web folks just said, okay, we'll do that. And they basically did it on the spot, and no one said anything, you know. So
no one's going to notice, right?
Yeah, right. It's such a subtle change that you can just change the CSS and it's done, and you're good. And it's just like that, and yeah, no one notices.
Well, there was a study, I forget where it is, but I've seen it a few times, where they were talking about, I don't remember if orange was one of them, it might have been, but it actually, in some cases, white on orange, even though it doesn't meet the contrast ratio, it actually is easier to read, like in a study that they did. So it's kind of funny, you know, it's like, well, we have to still measure contrast requirements based on certain things, but it's like, you know, is that really easier to read, or isn't it, you know?
Yeah. And that's why in the webinar that I watched, I think it was in the last couple of weeks about WCAG 3, they're approaching color completely differently, because the standard we have now is one of the few that I think is really easy to measure, but it also doesn't account for actual readability, because you can have some that meet the ratio that are, you can just tell by looking if with or without any kind of vision disability, that's awful and unreadable, but it'll still pass. So I don't know specifically the changes they're making, but I think that it's going to make it easier in the end. And they mentioned orange family colors in particular, because they are just you're kind of in a bind if you have orange right now. So I want to thank you again so much. I think this was fantastic.
Oh, yes, thank you.
All the talks are great, but I'm so glad that we could have someone come in and talk so much about the visual side of accessibility, because like I said, it's everywhere and it's in everything where people don't think about it. So thank you so much.